Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz pianist Dave Bass. He opened up about his stellar new 2019 CD called No Boundaries with the great Ted Nash, Karrin Allyson Carlos Henriquez, Jerome Jennings, and so many more. This kid from Cincinnati started playing piano at the age of 7, and shortly after graduating high school, he played in bands and opened for the great Captain Beefheart and Alice Cooper. And in the mid-'80s, after a random slip and fall on the way to a gig, it caused serious damage to his wrists, and doctors said that he may not play the piano ever again. He defied the odds, and after 20 years of being away from jazz and practicing law, he's back full-time, and No Boundaries is just the beginning. So please get to know this cat and dig this interview, my friends.
Okay, Dave, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz today, man. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Happy to be talking with you.
I just played No Boundaries this week on the show. It just happened to come up. I usually wait, but I've enjoyed this album so much. I love to give it the Pepsi Challenge in the car and drive around, and I've enjoyed this album so much that I just literally couldn't wait.
Wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you. And, you know, you got a lot of people on here. You got Karrin has Kansas City roots. You got Ted Nash, Jerome Jennings. You got so many people on this album that are just power players. So talk to me about how much of a joy this album had to have been to record.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, this is the first album I've recorded since I came back to music 24/7. As you may have heard, a wrist injury took me out of the music biz for a little over 20 years. I played music full-time right out of high school and been fairly successful, toured the world with Brenda Lee, etc. And then I had this wrist injury, took me out. And my first two albums, I was juggling both the attorney career I went to after I couldn't play anymore and music, which I came back to after not having played for over 20 years. I've now retired as an attorney. I'm back to music full-time. My wrist doesn't bother me at all. And this is the first time I've had an opportunity to focus 100% on the music and not be distracted by my obligations as an attorney. So I connected with Ted Nash when we both had albums out that we were submitting for Grammys. He's just a great guy, ridiculously talented. He plays all his instruments as if they were his only instrument, as opposed to the doubles. And he's, you know, in the jazz Lincoln Center Orchestra with the bass player Carlos Henriquez. So he hooked up with Carlos, which was great because, as you can hear, I like to play in a lot of different genres, and to find bass players, especially who play authentic Afro-Cuban and real swinging jazz, is not the easiest thing. And Carlos, of course, does both in spades. And yeah, so we, you know, I live in California, and went out to New York, and we had 2 days rehearsal. One day with the jazz band, essentially. One day with the Afro-Cuban group, with the three great Cuban musicians, and then went in the studio and did it in a couple of days. It was a joy. Everybody really had so much to offer. You could hear it just even in some of the more subdued tunes, like In the Rain. You hear the vibe that was created. You know, Jerome plays wonderful mallets on that, and very, very sensitive, and Ted's clarinet playing on that is also very sensitive. It's not one of the more exciting tunes on the album, but you really hear the vibe that we all had in the studio from the first time we played the tune. So I couldn't be happier.
So you grew up in Cincinnati. Give me an idea about your childhood and how you got into music.
Well, you know, like a lot of middle-class Jewish kids, I was given piano lessons when I was little and started playing when I was like 5 or 6. Loved playing, but didn't like to practice my lessons as much, and would just sort of go off and and essentially sort of start improvising early on, as opposed to just staying with the written page. I played music, in high school and in high school bands, and right after high school, I was in what we used to call progressive rock bands. We opened for Captain Beefheart back in Cincinnati at a place called the Ludlow Garage. Opened for Alice Cooper. I got to meet both of them as just a young kid, really. That's what it was like growing up in Cincinnati. It was a very conservative town politically. It being the 60s, I got out as soon as I could.
So you move on to the Berklee College of Music. You're around cats like Keith Jarrett and Steve Kuhn and Kenny Werner. What was that experience like? How did that kind of vault you into the music world?
That was a really interesting period. I did go to Berklee, but just for like 6 or 7 weeks. It was, Berklee was at that time training you to be a professional musician, learn how to play in all kinds of styles and go do gigs. And I was at that time much more interested in avant-garde jazz, being very creative. And so I only lasted at Berklee a short while. Fortunately, when I was there, I got to meet just this phenomenal piano teacher, Madame Shaloff, who was Serge Shaloff's mother. Serge Shaloff was one of the four brothers, baritone sax player. And she was an amazing teacher. I met Keith Jarrett at her studio. She also taught Kenny Werner, who's written a lot about his lessons with her. And I also got to study with George Russell, who interestingly is from Cincinnati. I didn't know him then. And he was at the New England Conservatory at the time. So I studied the Lydian chromatic concept with him back, we're talking like very late 60s, very early 70s. And that too was phenomenal, a phenomenal experience. Both he and Madame Shaloff were monumental musical talents. And I was very lucky that they, I was able to be in their presence, really, let alone, try to absorb what they were telling me about music and teaching me about music. Then I figured out that I couldn't make a living playing avant-garde jazz. Decided to just get a gig, just see if I could be a professional musician, which is what Berklee had been trying to teach me all along, of course, but I was too young and cocky to realize that. And I went on and just back in those days, there's no internet or anything, and I used to go in whatever the local free paper was, the Boston something. Bob Blumenthal used to write for it. That's how who did the liner notes, and that's how I knew Bob from his writing in that Free Boston newspaper. And I looked up in ads, looking for a pianist, looking for a bass player. Sure enough, I got a gig out on Route 128 playing with I guess you'd call it a lounge band. Just playing everything from Paul Simon to Elvis Presley to Muddy Waters. Started being able to make a living at it, and I was on the road with one of those bands, and somebody heard me and asked me to join their band, which turned out to be Brenda Lee's band, and then went to around the world with her, which was a great experience. I landed in San Francisco, which is where I really was introduced to the Afro-Cuban and Brazilian and Latin music, which has never left me. I mean, that was a deep connection for me. Got to play with a young Bobby McFerrin, who was my neighbor. We were good friends at the time. I could just go on and on. It's a long story.
Yeah, no, and that's good. And you're hitting a lot of points that I was going to ask. But what I wanted to ask, too, is that, you took 20 years off. You were in law. What did you learn about music during that time that you were away, and how has it helped you now?
It's a deep question, a good question on your part. It was pretty traumatic when in my mid-30s, when I had this injury. I had a young family. I had a daughter who was maybe 5, 6 years old then. I was like, holy smoke, what do I do? At that time, I liked to argue a lot more than I do now. Liked to read a lot. So I thought I'd become a lawyer. And it turned out I needed a BA to really get into a good law school. So I had to go all the way back, get BA, and get a law degree. And I really left music completely behind. I couldn't play and didn't play. And it was exciting for me to actually be in this new career. I was older, and a lot of people warned me that, I was graduating from law school at 42. I'd be competing with, brilliant young men and women who were in their early 20s, had a lot more physical stamina for the long hours, etc. But I dug it. It was very creative. It's not as creative as music, of course, which is why now that I can do both, I left the law. But it was creative, and it was you were surrounded by very, not always, but often very, very brilliant, talented people. It was a little more of a meritocracy than music too, in that, in music you can be unbelievably talented. I'm not talking about myself now. You don't get the recognition that talent should get, and then people in the music business who really aren't that talented, often for extraneous reasons, become recognized. Whereas the law, it's pretty straight up. I mean, either you can do the job or you can't, and if you can, it's recognized. So it was nice to have the hard work recognized in the legal world. It was just really a coincidence. I ended up as a deputy attorney general in California, which I was in Sacramento, and it was just a coincidence. It was actually some guy, a videographer, taping a deposition I was taking, who invited me to a party and heard I had played and invited me to play. And as soon as I was back into it, it was like, oh my God, how could I have stopped doing this? But the odd thing is up till then, I didn't really think about it too much. I listened to music a little bit. It was just way in my rearview mirror. But once I started playing again, everything resurfaced, and at that point, comparing the law with music, there was just so many more possibilities with the music. I'm happy I had both opportunities. It's really it was really a different world. My last boss was Kamala Harris, as a matter of fact, who was very appreciative of. We started my music career when I was working with her, working under her. She was my boss, and I juggled both things for probably almost 10 years, and then finally just went, the music thing is just too deep. I resigned from the California bar, and now it's music 24/7. And like I said earlier, the No Boundaries is the first CD I've done where the music is all I've had to focus on. It's really that's the way it's going to be from now on.
So, what was one of the first live shows you ever caught that really blew your doors down, especially jazz-wise?
Jazz-wise, well, the first live show, that's a tough one. I can tell you the first jazz album that really grabbed me, and that was Coltrane's Live at the Village Vanguard Again. That was the one. It was Alice Coltrane playing piano. It was, he had stopped playing, even though he was playing my favorite thing. You didn't always recognize it. And I was young when I heard that. And it just completely blew me away, and it set me on that path where I was entranced by the avant-garde scene, and I had to sort of backtrack and learn the background. The first live show I can remember wasn't really a jazz show. It was Captain Beefheart, of all people. Like I said, I opened for him. I'd been listening a lot to him, and it was just fascinating music. I thought it was all improvised, and just something special about it captured my ears. And then when I heard him play live, after the band I was in played, I recognized that it was note for note everything that was on the record, and they didn't have music in front of them, and they were all, in these bizarre costumes and whatnot, and it would just, to this day, it's still an experience I can remember in great detail, both sonically and visually. I mean, it really showed me sort of the very far boundaries of music, and what they were doing was, which I thought was pure improvisation, was instead, very, very finely wrought out, precise playing that I think they must have learned just by rote, because I don't think they read music. But they certainly didn't read when I saw them. So that's the first. That live show is really preeminent in my memory. And like I say, the Coltrane live, about the same period, really. Hearing that Coltrane live at the Village Vanguard again just sent me going on the path to jazz.
You obviously are a practitioner of jazz. You play it, you love it. Why is it? What resonates with you so much about jazz? Why do you love it?
At its best, it's spontaneous composition. I mean, it's a chance to use these standard frameworks that have been established now for almost 100 years. See what you can do with them. Use them as vehicles for self-expression, and simultaneously do that with the other cats you're playing with. And it doesn't always come off as great music, but when it does, it really can't be beat. And you can. Jazz has the wonderful quality of really being able to absorb just about any other style of music into it, and still make it work and make it seamless. So, as you know, I'm a big lover of the Afro-Cuban tradition, and since the '40s with Dizzy and Chano Pozo, that's worked, and it's still happening. Brazilian music, Bulgarian music in 7 and 15, certainly classical music. As you hear on No Boundaries, I bookend the album with a Lenny Tristano and a Bud Powell, both, from the 40s and 50s, both of whom I'm sure, I don't know this directly, but I'm sure they were deep into the classical repertoire at different points in their life. And you can hear it in their playing. Bud has a tune, Bud on Bach. Lenny doesn't overtly quote the classical literature, but you can tell he's been deeply influenced by it. And that's just such a rich source of inspiration. So that, for me, the jazz, it's just you're able to do really anything with it. And then you have the joy of experimenting in person with all the other cats who you're playing with and seeing what can happen. I think some of that magic, it's been called lightning in a bottle. Many different phrases try to describe that special feeling when the stuff really comes together. And I think it did sometimes in No Boundaries. You can, if you've seen any of the YouTube videos from the studio, you can see some of the looks on, say, Jerome Jennings' face when something really connects that he didn't expect before, and you see his face light up, and then that lighting up translates into what he plays next. And this is sort of happening all across the board. So it's there's really nothing like it, and there's no end to how expressive you can be in it.
So let's get down to you and the essence of you. Everyone has their version or interpretation of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but you know yourself best. Who do you think you are?
Well, in some ways I'm still trying to find out. One thing I can say about who I am is I'm a lucky guy. I mean, I've had a long, winding life, and in the many decades I've been alive, I think I've been very lucky to have ended up in a pretty nice place. So I never thought I'd be back in music again. That's for sure. So that feels really, really good to be able to be in a position to play with people like and record with cats like Ted and Carlos Henriquez and Jerome. And all the cats that I've worked with, Phil Woods. I mean, Phil Woods was on my second CD, the last studio recording he did. What a giant he was, and what a pleasure to hear him play on my tunes. So, in some ways, I'm still a work in progress. I mean, I have all these different interests, from reading and I love film. love poetry, I love history, love fiction, and all those things sort of, I can draw on all of those to create the music. I'm also very happily married. In fact, my wife, Nancy, came up with the title No Boundaries. We were trying to think of, what describes the fact that I, play all these different styles and can't remain, and I'm too restless, really, to just play straight ahead or just Latin or just standards. I have two great children that are wonderful young adults. So I'm I feel very, very lucky, and I'm going to try to use the position I find myself in now to just keep creating music that delights people and delights myself.
This is always a great question to wrap everything up with. It's always so positive. So thank you, Dave, for taking some time out to talk about No Boundaries. Thank you for the music, and continued success with this second half of your career.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in Cincinnati, San Francisco, Boston, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Dave for his time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.